Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to first thank the organizers and the sponsor of this event for this very precious opportunity for me to be in Manila for the first time. And some 5 years ago, I did have a chance until a minor bomb incident discouraged the United States government, which was my previous employer, to send me here. So the trip was cancelled back then, but now I'm here, so I'm so glad. Presenting on maritime security topic after Ian's story is always a challenge because, you know, just like a Bush doctrine, he, preempts a lot. So we have to cover a lot of some left ground. But anyway, because I'm from Japan, I think there's an expectation that I might talk about China's most recent news item, the air defense identification zone, which I will briefly touch on, but I just heard that the short piece I just wrote has come out from the Pacific Forum. So if you're interested in that subject, please take a look. And today I will mostly talk about the joint development business, which Ian just gave us some pessimistic views, and I too am pessimistic in a sense, but probably a little more optimistic than Ian. But anyway, here. Well, I'm not gonna do the college lecture on international law because there are a lot of lawyers here, I assume, and very simple, and territorial water, exclusive economic zone, and extended continental shelf. And the third one is particularly important because the United Nations Law of the Sea Commission on the Continental Shelf Delimitation set the deadline to submit the national claims. And meeting this deadline, China, Japan, Southeast Asia country, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, everybody submitted their claims, and this indeed forced every country to abandon ambiguities and come clear about their claims to a large extent. Of course, China's claim cannot be clear because it's not consistent with the existing international law, and if anything, it's an overstretching of particular clause on the territorial water applied to continental shelf concept. So it's not consistent. Well, East China Sea is a big issue, but for Japan, I didn't realize until somebody pointed out to me in a recent book that when you include all those EEZ and extended continental shelf claims, Japan has the 6th largest territory in the world. Most of them is under the water, by the way, but it's a very big area, and East China Sea is an important component of that. The boundaries here are mostly demarcated between Japan and Korea, except around the disputed island known as Takeshima, or what the Koreans call Tokdo Island, which is in the Sea of Japan side on the far upper right end of the line. But other than that, the maritime boundary has been demarcated. Of course, Korea's continental shelf claim exceeds the median line between Japan and Korea, which is used as a boundary. And Japan did make a concession to Korea by designating that area as a joint development zone. So the fishing activities is permitted by both Japanese and Korean fishermen in this joint development zone. But unfortunately, other type of exploration like gas and mineral and so forth are not very actively happening in this area. China tries to define the Senkaku Island dispute, or the Chinese call Diaoyu Island dispute, as a historical issue. And framing of the issue is very important, and oftentimes academics discuss this dispute as a historical issue without really thinking deep enough about why some countries want to frame it as a historical issue and other country doesn't want to do it. Well, in a sense, Japan is defining the problem as an international legal issue, whereas China is defining it as a historical issue. I would define it as a material issue, and both the Japanese government position and the Chinese government positions kind of downplay the actual material interest, and because material interests tend to make the countries look selfish and greedy and not objective. Well, the significance of the Senkaku Island is its location. You don't see this until you see this kind of a three-dimensional chart. And here you can see the Senkaku Island is located on the edge of the continental shelf, which China is claiming as its own. Instead of the equidistance, the median line between Japan's baseline and China's baseline, China is basically claiming the seabed all the way to the end of this continental shelf, or to the edge of the Ryukyu Trough, the deep pocket of water, which is shown in dark color, northwest side of the Okinawan chain of islands. When in fact, it is even debatable whether the continental shelf ends at the beginning of the Ryukyu Trough, or the Ryukyu Trough itself is just like a pond, and the continental shelf actually stretches all the way to the Okinawan Islands, and also Japanese archipelago is sitting on the very same continental shelf. Yeah. So how to define the continental shelf is already a subjective issue. Well, China claims that the continental shelf ends at the Ryukyu Trough, and China owns it. Yeah. And you can see the comparison here on this map. The Japan claimed equidistance line is shown in red, and the green dotted line is the end of the continental shelf China is claiming. So there's a very big overlap between Japan's claim and China's claim. And actually this is very similar to the overlap you can see in the, here, the claimed air defense zone. The China just declared the air defense identification zone, which is very much similar to China's claim to the seabed. Yeah. And of course, as you heard on various news sources, the disputed Senkaku Islands sit right under this declared air defense zone. Let me go back a little more. So why is this island significant? Well, because it's sitting on the very end of the continental shelf China is claiming. This is the first line of legal defense for Japan. In case it is objectively determined by any international organization that the boundary of the continental shelf is indeed the Ryukyu Trough, then Japan can still claim, well, but the continental shelf still does not exclusively belong to China because Japan owns an island on it. So this is a line of defense for Japan. And of course, the second line of defense, even better for Japan, is that, well, the Ryukyu Trough is not quite the end of the continental shelf. Ryukyu Trough is just like a pond on the continental shelf. Therefore, it is only fair to split the continental shelf in half. Let's take the middle line as a maritime boundary. So that would be the best outcome for Japan. Yeah. So the island, who owns the island is very significant. Therefore, it's disputed by China. For China, it creates an inconsistency in its legal argument. So, for China, a better solution than Japan owning that island is actually if that island erodes by waves and sink. That's good. If the island disappears, it's better than not having it from Chinese perspective. But anyway, the dispute is not limited to the island. Actually, Japan and China don't agree on the maritime boundary at all, and the problem is they found some gas in the areas, and China started digging, test drilling the gas fields just on the Chinese side of the median line, equidistance line. So, well, it's outside Japan's claimed maritime boundary. So why it's a problem? Well, the problem is that the gas fields seem to be connected underground. So China is sucking up all the gas from the Chinese side of Japan claimed maritime boundary. Of course, from Chinese point of view, it's no problem because it's well inside China's declared maritime boundary. So Japan has nothing to say. But from Japan, it's just outside Japan's line, but the gas is possibly siphoned from the Japanese side. So Japan raised this issue in 2005, and two countries entered the negotiation, and China eventually said, okay, let's start negotiating joint development. Well, in 2008, after the Prime Minister Koizumi of Japan did some, the nationalist kind of things which upset China, new Prime Minister Abe, in his first administration, not the current administration, Abe pledged to repair relationship with China, and he tried to keep those nationalist agenda down. Well, they, in principle, agreed on joint development, but negotiations since then didn't really progress much, especially when it came to details. So joint development has not happened. It's not easy. Easy to say, difficult to do. The part of the difficulty is that China knows that Japan's the partner, the negotiation position is not very strong. Without the geological data, Japan doesn't quite know how much gas is there, and private companies are not willing to commit their resources to test drilling on the Japanese side, which China sees as still within their side. So Japan's position is difficult. And even if Japan does find out how much gas sits there, it's still not easy, because how do you bring it to the market? The gas is worthless if you just pump it to the sea. You have to bring it to the market. And the northwest side of the Ryukyu Trough is a flat, shallow water, and China can easily lay pipeline there. It's shallower than 200 meters on the northwest side. Bringing the same gas to Okinawa, you cannot lay pipes across the Ryukyu Trough, which goes like 2,000 meters deep. And if Japan tries to bring that gas somehow to Okinawa or to the rest of Japan, the gas is going to be too expensive, and no private companies want to invest in that. So the best outcome Japan can hope is simply join the Chinese venture as a shareholder and get certain percentage of the profits as its share. China knows it. So China has a very strong negotiating position. And even worse, China's joint development proposal actually included a joint exploration on the Japanese side of the median line. And this is a legal Trojan horse. If Japan agrees to that, China can use it as a precedence that Japan accepted China's legal jurisdiction, yeah, beyond the equidistance median line. So of course Japan immediately rejected this offer. So the lesson here is that sure, joint development might be the only way to diffuse the tensions in difficult situations, but don't bet on it, because countries do sneaky things. Well, earlier China actually invited UNOCAL and Royal Dutch Shell as joint venture partners in the East China Sea gas fields. And when the dispute between Japan and China escalated, those two international partners withdrew. But China did that in anticipation of strengthening its political bargaining position. Yeah. In South China Sea, this has an implication because probably those big gas companies are reluctant to join, but there are a lot of smaller independent companies in the United States which are willing to partner with one of the disputing parties in the South China Sea. And they can complicate the situation. But the difference in the South China Sea is that the kind of dilemma Japan suffers from in the East China Sea, the China suffers in the South China Sea. For China to ship that oil and gas to China through pipeline is either technologically not feasible or economically too expensive. So in the joint development discussed between the Philippines and China, or China and other partners, it's easier for China to simply get a percentage of the profit as a shareholder and leave aside the question of under whose jurisdiction the joint venture is managed. Yeah, so this is a strength for the Philippines and other Southeast Asian partners. Maybe the Vietnam's case in the western part is a different situation. And well, is it possible to set aside the question of boundary demarcation? Well, Dr. Story just said the boundary has to be demarcated first. I differ on that point. I think each country can agree to exempt the seabed oil and gas resources from national control and establish some sort of international legal regime by agreement and exploit the gases and oil. But I agree with Ian on the point that it's not likely to happen in a multilateral context. If it does, it has to be bilateral. And bilateral meaning China and one of the parties in Southeast Asia. And it's going to be possible only in the areas claims are not overlapping beyond the two countries' context. So that will exclude a lot of the areas around Spratly Islands, but it's possible on the periphery. It's just a map of Vietnam-India joint venture. The Indian participations, again, from Vietnam's perspective, I think taking India as a partner is a sort of a political message against China. And recently, I think there was a second and maybe third announcement of newer areas of India-Vietnam cooperation. Let me go back, sorry, a couple of slides here. Well, I talked a little bit about joint ventures, but I'm not arguing that joint ventures will lead to confidence building and eternal peace and so forth. I'm not that optimistic. But the joint ventures can postpone the conflicts. And fish is good because fish is a sustainable resource. If you manage, they last for a long, long time. Oil and gas will deplete at some point. So even if you manage it well, when the resources are depleted, the conflicts will be back. But without resource, what are they going to dispute about? The control. So I have to talk about some of the military issues as well. Well, China recently declared air defense identification zone, and this is inevitable. It was going to happen at some point. Well, why now? Couldn't China wait a little bit longer? Why, they could, but it came anyway. Right? I think US National Security Advisor was partly responsible for that speech at the Georgetown University. You can access it on the web and watch her speaks only generally about maritime disputes in East China Sea and South China Sea without mentioning the word Senkaku, until some student asked a specific question about it. Well, in her speech, she urged all parties to refrain from aggressive behavior, which could be applicable in South China Sea but inappropriate in East China Sea, because aggressor in East China Sea was China. Well, when the student asked the questions, she didn't answer it well. She didn't refer to the US-Japan Security Treaty, Article number 5, which obliges the United States to defense of all territories under Japanese administrative control. If I were a Chinese watching that speech, I would be encouraged to take some aggressive action. But of course, maybe it's just a coincidence of timing. You never know. Well, China declared it anyway, and China is going to achieve the capability to enforce this declared air defense zone, which it currently does not have. But it will have such a capability in the coming years. So until then, we'll have to manage, because China is not likely to back down from what it has already announced. So from now until China has a capability, we will defer the conflicts, somehow manage it, avoid incidents, as Ian was talking about, incidents on the water, incidents in the air. Yeah. And there are many things two countries can do, formally and informally. But I would think the informal part is going to be more important than formal part in East China Sea. South China Sea might be a different case. In South China Sea, I think the air defense announcement will come at some point, but also the submarine use of the South China Sea is getting more important. China just sent its aircraft carrier to the base on the Hainan Island, and Hainan was already developed as a submarine base. The strategic submarines can join the port submerged. And this is very important for China's limited nuclear retaliatory capability against the United States. And in coming years, China will develop its strategic submarine forces, and South China Sea becomes increasingly important, just like the Sea of Okhotsk was important for the Soviet Union during the Cold War years. China doesn't have a capability to keep the Americans out of the South China Sea, but it will aim at achieving that capability. So again, in between, the conflicts need to be managed. Well, I think I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'll just wrap it up by going back to the joint development issues. What drives joint ventures in disputed water? Some countries simply need capital, so need to take partner. Otherwise, resources just sit in there. Some countries do not have technological sophistication yet, so they need to take partners. But China cannot dig in the deep water yet, so in some areas China needs to depend on the Western partners to do a joint ventures, and that will have political implications. Or entering the joint venture alters profit calculations. Like China cannot make profit if it tries to bring gas from whatever part of South China Sea back to China. Sometimes it's much more profitable to just sell it in the Philippines, sell it in Malaysia, and so forth. Well, the joint venture is the only way to exploit the resource. So countries have no choice. As Ian said, otherwise resources just sit there untapped. The political consideration is important. Bringing American companies on board, even the smaller ones, is very important consideration, both for China and for Southeast Asian countries, and relatively acting freely, those smaller companies may actually partner with both China and Southeast Asian countries. And the last one is the legal Trojan horse I earlier mentioned. China will keep making offers with this kind of Trojan horses, and the countries need to be very careful, and especially if the domestic politics of any of those Southeast Asian countries has issue with corruptions, this become a major issue in dealing with China. So I'll stop here and back to John. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Dr. Sato. Now we're going to have a short break. I would like, since we're about a couple of minutes early, if we could just get back just before 11 o'clock, about 5 to 11, so we'll start a couple of minutes early, so we'll begin the round table. So we'll have a short break now, and if we could just be back by about, can reconvene just before 11 o'clock, and we'll have, so we'll be able to start on time at 11, have the round table. I'm sure you'll have many questions for these gentlemen after the break. Thank you very much.